All right, we're here in this windy venue as the seasons are changing in the high country of Colorado to do our second part in the series of Is Jesus God? And of course, we believe He is. And today I want to give you 5 points that do not come from the Bible, 5 points to consider that come from other sources that would demonstrate that Jesus is God. And the first thing I want you to understand is, and my first point is this, historians writing even 1 to 2 decades after His death and resurrection began to mention Jesus Christ. Most of these historians were not Christians. Most of these historians actually were hostile to the Christian faith, and yet they document His death, and they even document some of the miracles that occurred around His death, like the great earthquake and the darkening of the sun. These historians were not writing to promote Christianity. In most cases, they were writing with disgust towards this brand new church that had just started to spring up around the known world. And so the success of that early church, documented by historians, is the first evidence I would give to you that begins to throw light on the fact that Jesus is God. Or else, how else could all of these things happen? So we already considered the historians of that time, and they document the fact that Jesus lived and was executed by Rome in Jerusalem, and they documented some of the miraculous earthquakes and things that occurred, but that doesn't prove that He's God. So let me suggest something else now. On the day Jesus died, He had 12 disciples. One of them had already betrayed Him and would soon take his own life, and the other 11 ran away scared. These guys were ordinary men, fishermen. One was a tax collector, some were zealots, not very well educated men at all, and certainly men who hadn't traveled very far except maybe from their hometown in Israel to Jerusalem and back. And then a few short weeks after His death, as Jesus promised, the Holy Spirit visited them and filled them. And suddenly these 11 men became giants of the Christian faith. They traveled throughout most of the known world: India, Iraq, Iran, southern Spain, northern Africa. They traveled around the known world spreading the faith, and suddenly became wildly successful, and churches were planted all around, even the unbelievable into Rome itself. The change in the disciples' lives proves to me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who supernaturally drove these men to good works they could have never done on their own. The next evidence that Jesus is God and directs His church supernaturally, I'd like to call the evidence that the church is self-correcting. Today around the world, the Christian church is known for building orphanages and hospitals and schools for both boys and girls. But if we were to go back in time, we would see a different history, a dark period of history in the time of the church. Basically from the time Constantine declared Christianity to be the religion of state for the Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic Church was Christianity in Western civilization, clear until over 1,000 years later when the Reformation took place. And during those dark and feudal times, the church also became feudal, and the Catholic Church had its own armies, and they sought to pull knights together from all of Europe and launch crusades to retake the Holy Land from the folks who already occupied it. And by all accounts, atrocities were committed by those Christian armies. A bad time in church history. How did the church regather itself, push away from that heritage, and step into a time of enlightenment where they suddenly became the champions, passing child labor laws and requiring lifeboats on ships and all kinds of different causes? How did that happen? except that Jesus Christ, the head of the church, reinstituted the actual gospel message, which has never changed, and people were convicted by the Holy Spirit within the church to say no to that legacy and to step into the life of loving the world the way Christ compels us to love. All right, so we've looked at the historians who document that Jesus lived, that he died on that cross, and they document some of the spectacular events that occurred around his death and resurrection and the beginning of the Christian church, but that doesn't prove that he's God. So consider this as a logical evidence that he's God. On the day Jesus died, of his 12 disciples, one had betrayed him and killed himself, and the other 11 had run away. One had even forsaken him and swore that he didn't know him 3 times. They deserted him. And yet, after his resurrection, in a few short weeks, the Holy Spirit fills these men who are largely uneducated and have rarely traveled outside of Israel, if ever. And now these men become giants of the faith that travel throughout the known world, die martyrs' deaths in foreign countries. They reach India, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Spain, and even Rome itself. These men become these powerhouses that transform the world with the Christian faith. What was the change that came over them? The only thing I think that's logical to assume is that the Spirit of God did come into them exactly as Jesus said it would on the night before his death, came into them and drove them to heights they could have never reached any other way. It's one of the proofs that Jesus is God. In 2010, there was a poll that measured how many believers there were in the various religious systems in the world. 31% of the world, 2.2 billion people, identified as Christians. Maybe the greatest proof that Jesus is God is the testimony of the believers for the last 2,000 years. Through every generation, believers have lived for Jesus and died for Jesus. Some have died martyrs' deaths, but most have lived out a normal life, believing in Jesus and finding provision and wisdom and love and forgiveness and the grace of God, all of the good things of the faith. A cult might be able to manipulate a handful of people into believing something ridiculous, but 2 billion people can't be manipulated into believing something unless it's true and unless it's driven by the Son of God himself, Jesus Christ. That's what we believe, and that's the most powerful evidence that he is who he says he is, and he continues to be that today. For those of us who believe it, there's always room for someone else who discovers a living relationship with the living God, Jesus Christ.